When the seagulls follow the shore, it's because they think sardines will be thrown into the sea. Thank you.
And as we say now in my country, they brought the bus and they left the bus in front of the goal.
And the guy's talking absolute nonsense. Never heard so much rubbish in my life.
Normal men.
What do you mean, normal men?
We're just innocent men.
I'm telling you, don't back down, double down. Don't back down, double down.
Hello and welcome to Tuesday's episode of the Bhoycie Bus with me, Mark Kearney. I'm joined today by a special guest, Matthew Marr. Matthew Marr is a Celtic fan. He's also an author and he's written a fantastic book that I can't wait to read. It's called Glory to Their Name. It's about Celtic's first league title in 1892-93. So first of all, Matthew, thanks for coming on, and how you doing, mate?
Thanks very much for having me, Mark. No, things are going well. We're on for title number 53, so it seems to be a good time to be going back to talking about title number 1.
Oh, God, good man. I'm a bit of a history buff when it comes to Celtic and history in general. So just thought I start off with asking you, what was your motivation behind writing this book? Was it solely based on you loving the history of Celtic, or was it you wanting to share the magical history we've got in this fantastic football club?
I think it was a little bit of all things. I mean, I've for years, I've wanted to write a book. I did a history degree. I work with history every day, and I'm really interested. And from Celtic's perspective, I've been going to see Celtic. It's more than 40 years since I went to my first game. I don't remember it, as to be said, but it's a long time I've been going to see Celtic. And because of that, you sort of thought, right, I would really like to write a book. And I think for me, the COVID played a big part of being a sort of the kick that you needed. Obviously during COVID, we couldn't go to games, we couldn't really do very much. And you found yourself, at night and whatever, sort of, well, I've got this spare time. I'm not going to games on Saturdays. And some of the research can be done online. So for me, that was the sort of trigger of, I want to do it. This seems like a good a time as any to force myself to do it. And we did. And I've been really delighted with it. As you were saying, you're looking forward to seeing it. I mean, I went with a company called the Celtic Star Books. So, I mean, that's where you can get it. You can get it online at CelticStarBooks.com. You can actually also get it in the Celtic shop, which I was really delighted about. That was when we beat Rangers last week. It was full celebration, because not only that was the most important one, but I also got to go into the shop and see my book on the shelf, which was just fantastic. So
That's great, man.
I've been really it looks fantastic, and I hope that the people that that buy it are going to enjoy firstly hearing the story tonight, but also reading it if they get the book as well.
We'll go into the book in a wee minute or two. It's a story of espionage, kidnap, financial mishandlings and lies and all the rest of it. It's just the average season in Scottish football. So I think what I've noticed is the most fascinating part about this book is I think the football almost becomes the second story within this book. And I don't mean that to kind of downplay the role in which Celtic play on the park, but the story itself, I think if it was in a TV show or a movie, it'd become a bit, it would be non-fiction, a bit like this book. If I didn't know it was the truth, I'd think it was in the non-fiction section. So we'll get into that in a wee minute. And to be quite honest with you, a few months ago on the podcast, we do wee segments on the show, and one of the questions was if you could go back in time to a moment in Celtic's history and watch any given game, what would it be? And most of our viewers were saying 10 men won the league in 79 and 67. And I says, look, the most important game Celtic have ever played was the very first game. And I think when some of the characters in that match, we had Neil McCallum, we had James Kelly, Willie Maley, Tom Maley. These guys that I just mentioned, or at least three of them, all played a huge role in this title winning season. None more so than Neil McCallum. He played a kind of key role in that season. And one of the stories you're going to tell me involving Sandy McMahon. It's a story that I never knew about, and probably most Celtic fans. And Celtic seem to always pride themselves, or the fans do, in knowing your history. And our history of this club is so vast and so interesting that you can't pick up all the stories. So it's going to be great to have a guy like yourself coming on the show and giving us all a wee bit of a lesson on some of the most exciting things that's happened at Celtic in the very early days. And in season 1892-93, I think this was the very first season of the new Celtic Park. Is that correct? Is that correct, Matthew?
It was, yeah. I mean, as you've said, Mark, the story, the football is obviously important. I mean, obviously, without the football, there isn't a story. But actually, a lot of the most interesting things happen off the park. Sometimes nothing to do with the football at all. At the start of the season, so August 1892 was a time of massive, massive change for Celtic. Some of which we would recognise now, and other which we wouldn't. The first big one was when Brother Walfrid left. So Brother Walfrid, obviously, vitally important, founder of the club. He went off to London. He was sent there by the Marrists to do similar work to what he'd been doing in Glasgow's East End, but this time in London. So obviously losing your founder is a big deal. But in terms of the thing that continues to live on, that was when we first moved. We first went to Celtic Park. So obviously Celtic, we play our first game in May 1888, and we get our new ground, Celtic Park. And it's funny because, a lot of the people at the time spoke about, why were we in, what were the Irish in Scotland for? Well, partly because they were escaping greedy landlords. And that's exactly the problem that we found with the first Celtic Park. The landlord obviously realised a good thing, decided that he wanted a 9-fold increase in the amount we were paying in rent. And I think maybe expected Celtic to pay it on the grounds we had invested a bit of time and all the rest of it. Celtic instead turned around and said, no, we'll go elsewhere. And I mean, one of the really interesting things is the way that history could be. We think of Celtic, they play in the East End of Glasgow, but actually we came very close at that point in time from Nut. Springburn was a very serious possibility that we could have moved to, even south side of the river, and other places were looked at. But in the end, obviously, the board decided they wanted to stay much closer to where we'd been. And it was quite literally a stone's throw. So the second Celtic Park, which is the current Celtic Park, you could quite easily kick a ball from one end, if you were to be at the old Rangers end, as it were, and kick a ball towards where the Iron Brew factory was, you'd hit the original Celtic Park. So it really was close. And by all accounts, it was an amazing stadium by the standards of its time. It was one of the biggest in Britain. There was journalists came from all over Britain, and they were just enthralled with it, spoke about how it was this magnificent arena. Some of them, spoke about it being, the biggest and best anywhere in Europe. So it was an amazing deal deal. And it's actually quite interesting because it probably has had a long-term impact of not dissimilar to what Fergus McCann did. Fergus McCann built us a stadium, with 10,000 seats more than anything else in Glasgow, and that gave us a prestige and an income, which was really important to building the Celtic we've got just now. That's what the first Celts did, by going to that stadium, even though they perhaps hadn't wanted to move. It turned out to be a great thing. We had a bigger ground, we were able to attract more money, we were able to attract other games like internationals and cup finals, and that all played a role. And so the first thing comes down to August 1892. That was when we moved into what we would consider paradise and home.
Well, it's a good point, because I think I've mentioned it before in the chats and on the podcast as well. Celtic, since their very first days, have been mold breakers, history makers, and they also want to buck the trend and create new standards. And I think that becomes very clear. This how Celtic using an almost formation that you see just now under Ange Postecoglou. We would have 4 wingers as such, 2 inverted, two further out, and with 1 striker. And that's the sort of football you see just now with Celtic. The kind of inverted fullbacks turned into wingers and things like that, and just shows you that even back in the 1890s, Celtic were playing football that you would see in 2023 and still be impressed with. And I think that's where our kind of story starts about Celtic just beginning to build a team and build in those days a brand that would become a serious operator in the world of football. I mean, when I was doing my history or doing a bit of research into this, I noticed that there was a lot of games we played at the beginning of the season and during the season against English opposition. And first of all, I thought that might be money motivated, but I wasn't sure how the seasons kind of worked out back then. Was it normal for teams like Celtic to, in those times, break the season up by playing friendly matches in England and then games at Hampden against English opposition and charity matches and things like that? Was that kind of normal back then, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what you've got to remember is football in the 1890s and right at the start looks really different from today. So nowadays, naturally, we think that the league's the big important trophy in terms of Scotland. That was absolutely not the case. So when we first win the league, the reaction, it would probably be best described as muted. At that point, what you really wanted to win was the Scottish Cup. The Scottish Cup was the big trophy that everyone wanted to win. And Celtic they'd won it the year before for the first time. And that remained the issue. It remained what like Celtic really wanted. There's, for a long time when we were debating what to call the book, I toyed with a bit of satisfaction, because that was a newspaper quote at the time saying Celtic have lost the Scottish Cup, but at least they've got a bit of satisfaction by winning the league. And it seems really strange to our ears, the idea that we would say, oh well, you didn't win the Scottish Cup, but I suppose you can make do with the league instead. But that was just the way it was.
Normally they're quite opposite. I think
a lot of this, it does come down to money, including the English clubs, but a lot of it comes down to something else that changes in the season, which is professionalism. So until 1893, it was against football rules in Scotland to pay players. So you couldn't have professionalism. Now, that was the rules, and the reality is almost everyone regularly broke it. And so usually before we go to 1890 is the first year we've got a league. Before that, football's very ad hoc. You play in various competitions like cup games. So you've got national, the Scottish, you've got sort of regional. So in Celtic sense, that would be things like the Glasgow Cup, the Glasgow Charity Cup. But you've got even more local trophies. So Celtic's first ever trophy, which they won in 1889, was the Glasgow North Eastern Cup. And all across the country, that's the same. And actually, the main way you make your money, the main thing is friendlies. Friendlies make up the bulk of fixtures. And English clubs, frankly, attracted much more money. Fans maybe weren't going to come out in big numbers to watch Celtic play Cowlairs in a friendly, but thousands were going to come out if, Sunderland or Blackburn, that were two of the really big teams at the time, came up. So that was what, we spent our time doing that quite simply because of money. But like I say, a lot of that came down to the issue of the ability to pay players. Officially, you weren't allowed to do it. The reality is we did it. And that's really where the league came from. Because if you're going to pay players, even if it's secretly, you have to have a guaranteed income. And obviously, friendlies where you might not be able to arrange them, cups, you could get knocked out the first round of the cup. So if you want to have a sort of guaranteed amount of money you're going to get, you need guaranteed games, and that's what a league entails.
Well, you need some sort of income regardless. Yeah, income regardless of results or form, you know what I mean? And speaking about English clubs, I wanted to dive into the story of Sandy McMahon. This is a story that I touched on at the beginning of the show. I mean, I mentioned espionage. It's something about a Russian spy movie, this story. And this is a story about Celtic player Sandy McMahon. And I think Neil McCallum might have been involved. He was the first ever Celtic goal scorer, for anybody who's not familiar. And for me, probably part of them, their most important Celtic team in our history, because I feel like if the first game didn't go to plan or the first game bombed, I don't think we'd be sitting here now on a Celtic podcast. So for me, that's bigger than Lisbon. It's bigger than any other title we've won that match. And some of the characters that Tom Maley, Willie Maley, Neil McCallum, James Kelly, these guys all came from other clubs for that day and eventually signed for the club. And so Sandy McMahon and Neil McCallum, they end up in England somewhere, and there's a wee story about Celtic using something you would see in some sort of Dan Brown novel. Do you want to get that for me a wee bit?
So Neil, as you say, Neil McCallum is obviously an important Celtic hero, the first ever man to score for Celtic and all the rest of it. The reality is, though, he's a bit of a villain in this story. So, you know, for the reason, back to money that I was just saying before, the reality is English clubs could offer much more money, not dissimilar to the situation that we've got today. And so a lot of the top Scottish clubs, especially because, again, officially you couldn't pay players in Scotland, a lot of the very best players in Scotland were naturally attracted down to England, where, you know, they thought they could make much more money and build a better life for themselves. So at the start of 1892, the season 1892-93, even though we just won the so-called Holy Trinity of trophies, we weren't really favourites because we were expected to lose most of our team. You know, most of them were getting linked with moves down south. And certainly Neil McCallum and Sandy McMahon both ended up in Nottingham. There was actually some stories claiming that they'd actually signed for Ardwick, who become Manchester City eventually. But in any case, they're in Nottingham, and we want to find them. Now, this is one of the strange things in those days. The way of signing for a club wasn't quite as the way we would expect it just now. To some extent, what tied you to a club was playing for them. So it wasn't unknown if you had a player that you wanted and knew other people, including perhaps his own club, wanted back, you would basically kidnap them. You would hide them until you could get them to play a game, because once they'd played a game, they couldn't then just go and play, you know, for another team, especially not in the same country. So Sandy McMahon was in Nottingham along with Neil McCallum, and we wanted him. And as you say, it does read like a spy novel because there's various accounts of this story. One account say that so we sort of sent a search party after him. There was a bit of cloak and dagger stuff. We let it be publicly known that our search party knew he was in London, and so we'd sent the search party to London. In actual reality, we knew that he was in Nottingham, and that was where we were sending people. How are we going to find them, though? Well, one interesting story says this: Notts County, who we play later in the season, a friendly, whether those two things are related, their committee, who don't want somebody like Sandy McMahon signing for their rivals, were basically phoning or contacting Glasgow, maybe not phoning, but contacting Glasgow and saying, this is where you can find them. So eventually, the Celtic search party, which included Sandy McMahon's brother, they find them. And they basically say, come back to Scotland. Neil McCallum, however, this is the point at which there's a villainy element, steps in as if to say, no, he's not coming. He's not coming back with you. He's staying here. And I'm not coming back with you either. Apparently, McCallum was told, we didn't ask you to come back. We only want Sandy. So he comes. So Sandy McMahon agrees, I'll come back. And they're like, so they basically run away from Neil McCallum and another guy called Alexander Barber, who was also a former Renton player, who was also in Nottingham. And they get to a cab, and they get in the cab and they say, take us to wherever. And at that point, Neil McCallum tells the cab driver, he basically threatens him, if you take these guys, because this guy's meant to sign for Forest, if you take them, I'm going to let it be known that it was you. The cab driver also, wants just an easy life, tells them to get off. So eventually they have to make their own way another way. I don't know how, but they get away from Neil McCallum eventually. They find their way in a pub. So they stay at the pub overnight. But next day they want to go to Manchester to get a train. But, well, what are the Forest Committee going to be there? They're going to be looking out for their prize because they're definitely not happy they've lost it. So there's an element of having to sneak into Manchester, hope there's nobody there that might recognise you. They get on the train. They're on the train back to Glasgow. You might think that's the end of the story, but even then they're still really, really paranoid. So in those days, the main train station would have been the St Enoch station, but they don't get off at that. They deliberately jump off one station early at Eglinton Toll. And they get off there for the simple reason that they think, well, if Forest have got any men in Glasgow station, they surely won't have any there. And they do that. And at that point, he's home to stay. There's a wee bit of arguments in the papers. Forest claim we've kidnapped him. We make Sandy McMahon basically sign a letter of apology to Forest saying, I'm very sorry for wasting your time, but I'm home to stay, and so on. And it's just a very strange story. It's the idea of, you can imagine, if Ange's next target, you sort of heard, had been bundled into the back of a car, hidden under a blanket so his own club didn't know. That's essentially
his Wi-Fi switched off and no internet. And I mean, Sandy McMahon, he went on to score 11 goals that season, top goal scorer. And it's a wee bit of meat on the bone on that one. I mean, Celtic season, we ended up with 29 points and we scored 54 goals. So 11 goals coming from one player is a huge percentage of your, that's like roughly 20% of your goals that season. We didn't have assists back then. I'm pretty sure he was probably involved in that. So just shows you how important a player that was we got back from England. And I always think football was surrounded by sliding doors moments. Players coming and going. It can only be a last minute equaliser can cost you a job. Alex Ferguson then winning the Cup Winners' Cup at Man U. If he loses that match, would they have been the club they were today? I'm not sure. And there's plenty of other stories around the world in the football clubs. And I think Celtic are the same. I mean, Celtic in the early 1900s, we went on to win 6 league titles. And I think that's a very important period in Celtic's history, is the very beginning of your club, because I think the season 92-93, you said that there was like roughly 2,000 or 3,000 fans showed up, I think I heard you saying, and for the victory of that. And do you know what? It's probably not outkeeping with the actual normal crowds back then and normal kind of, crowds for victory parades or anything like that. So it probably was your average what it should be. Celtic have times that by 20 and 30 times in big matches now. So we all know what Celtic are capable of now, but the roots go back to Celtic's very, very beginning. And I think this book, although the football, I think, as I said, is going to cover, probably, I think the mind is going to be drawn to the stories. And there's another story about Dan Doyle, a wee bit of a sad story as well, but also a wee bit of an interesting story, and one that I think I personally didn't know this story either. And I like to think myself that I know the wee kind of anecdotes about Celtic. This one could be sad, but it's a wee bit of a story as well with Dan Doyle. I think he was in Everton at the time. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it was actually before he was at Everton. So Dan Doyle,
Right.
again, another early Celtic legend. He was club captain for a while, and he's a really, really important part of the 1892-93 season. But really a genuine tragedy, which he knew. By all accounts, an incredibly interesting character, a bit of a womanizer, a drinker, a gambler, and a multitude of things like that. But sadly, was also a story not dissimilar to the John Thompson one, where he was involved in the death of a player. So he was playing for Grimsby at the time, and he was playing against a team called Staveley. And in that, one of the Staveley players was a guy called William Cropper. And at one point in the game, now football in those days was much rougher nowadays. It's really, you talk about the levels of protection that people might get, and it's a man's game, and all the some of the stuff you hear quite regularly spoke about, including in recent weeks. But the reality is, it's just unrecognisable. It was a much more physically demanding, and often I think things that we would consider violent. So in any case, Dan Doyle went in for a challenge on William Cropper. Basically banged into him, and Cropper sort of complained, pains to the abdomen, and died within a couple of days. Dan Doyle himself was cleared of any sort of fault. There was an inquiry into it. The referee himself said, it wasn't a bad tackle. It was just, it's just one of those things that's happened, basically. But that was a real sad story that followed Dan Doyle for the rest of his life. I mean, especially when he was playing in England, he would hear there was sometimes shouts from the crowd. There was, newspapers would bring it up. I mean, I suppose not dissimilar to a lot of the story about Sam English, in terms of John Thompson, that'll happen, about 50 years after that. So Dan Doyle, when he came to Celtic, I think Dan Doyle came to Celtic partly because he was paid, partly because he wanted to, but I suspect there was an element that he wanted an opportunity to get away from, some of the...
Reinvent himself a wee bit and forget that.
Yeah, that would have
No,
haunted him.
It reminds me a wee bit of sort of similar to Lee Griffiths. No, obviously there's a darker side to that story, but somebody who's maybe just had a wee bit of a reputation for bad things, and it just follows you through your career, and has unfortunately ended up with that happening to him. And maybe Celtic was seen as a kind of a new start for the guy, and maybe pastures new, but also I'm pretty sure even back then Celtic were seen as this kind of like a phoenix for the ashes, you know what I mean? They were rising up, and even for the very beginning, I mean, I touched on crowds and attendances. I mean, Celtic's very first match against Rangers, I think there was a crowd of 5,000 or 6,000 at that match, and that's something that, and that was kind of unheard of even in those days. And so in the new Celtic Park, we just touched on, I mean, the attendances could reach into their 20s and 30,000s later on, I believe. So just shows you the club itself knew this club was going places, and signing these kind of guys, they're no accidents. That's Celtic also is kind of like visionaries, where they can see that there's a player there, he needs a fresh start. And Celtic, I think, over the years have did that with players that maybe needing a wee arm around their shoulders, and Dan Brown seems to be, Dan Doyle seems to be somebody who fits into that category, and I'm glad he came to Celtic and it worked out for him, because you say they went to captain the club and became a bit of a legend. And even the front cover of your book, have you got it there? Johnny Madden's on the front cover of the book, and that's a Celtic great there. And the strip as well. I mean, people might not know the strip's different. Do you want to explain maybe why the strip's different to what Celtic fans might not recognise just now?
Absolutely. So, as you say, the front cover is Johnny Madden. I'll come back to him in a second. But I think if you watched Celtic, if you could somehow transport yourself back in time, the big thing you'd instantly notice is the strip. So, in simple terms, you've had three. There's a slight debate about a fourth strip. So, obviously, the first Celtic strip is the white strip that we wear in our first game. By 1889, and then by 1903. We've got what we would all recognise as, the world famous hoops. But from 1889, and certainly when we win our first trophy, the North Eastern Cup, we're wearing stripes. So we've moved to green and white stripes. There is some newspapers actually suggest at times we played in all green tops as well, and not as an away strip. But that was, I think, I'm not sure if these would just been sort of one-offs. But in terms of formal strips, at this point, green and white stripes are what Celtic are wearing. The reason that we've moved to that's really not abundantly clear. Obviously, green is in keeping, with the Irish history of the club. But that's what Celtic would have been thought about just now. Would have been very, if there had been if we'd had mascots at that time, presumably it would have been Stripey the Huddle Hound, rather than anything else. But so we've got the stripes now. As you say, the front of the book, this guy here is Johnny Madden. Now, Johnny Madden is another massive Celtic player. We've had also an interesting transfer story at the start of that season. Interestingly, yesterday was the 75th anniversary of Johnny Madden's death. He died living in Prague, which is part of the interesting part of his story in 1948. So Johnny Madden was a forward. He was from Dumbarton, and like all footballers at the time, because officially you couldn't be paid, he had his own job, and his job was a riveter. He was a riveter on a shipyard, as obviously many men at that time would have been. He's a really, really interesting character, Madden. I've often told this story, but there's an argument that if his Johnny Madden shooting had been better one day, there wouldn't be a Celtic. And the reason for that is, well, obviously part of the reason that Celtic were formed was Hibs' Scottish Cup success in 1887. So Hibs, 1887, win the Scottish Cup. Hibs are really the representative of Irish identity in Scotland at that point. And so the first thing the Hibs players do is they don't go back to Edinburgh, they go to the East End of Glasgow, they go to St Mary's Church, where of course Celtic will be formed later in that year. And at the celebration, marking Hibs' Scottish Cup triumph, which was a really big deal for the Irish in Scotland. The story is that this was where Brother Walfrid took the inspiration to say, we need to be doing this in Glasgow. The really interesting thing, though, is Hibs were perhaps a bit lucky to win the Cup that day, because Dumbarton, by all accounts, had a lot of chances. And the Dumbarton centre-forward, who missed a barrowload of chances, was in fact Johnny Madden. So if Johnny Madden had scored those chances, Hibs don't win the Scottish Cup. And would there have been an Irish team in Glasgow? There probably would have been, but would it have been Celtic and then? Probably not. So there's an another sliding doors moment. In any case, Madden's a really important Celtic player. He's one of the main forwards that we've got that season. He's another one that had a transfer shenanigan. There was a bit of divine intervention that brought Johnny Madden to Celtic, because he had also gone to England, and he was in Sheffield. And one account that's told by a Sheffield Wednesday historian is that a priest was basically sent to hunt for him, found Johnny Madden in Sheffield, and brought him back to Glasgow, so that we didn't lose him that season. So just at the same time as we could have lost Andy McMahon, we could have lost Johnny Madden, which would have been fatal to the hopes of winning the league and any other sort of success that season. But Johnny Madden's big story isn't in Scotland. Johnny Madden's big story is in Czechoslovakia or Bohemia or the Czech Republic, depending on what you want to call it, depending on the time, because he's considered by many people to be the father of Czech football. He moved to Prague in the early 1900s and basically became a club manager, was involved in running the international team. And to this day, if you go to Slavia Prague's ground, part of it's named after him. So he's really seen as an iconic figure, and he's a massive Celtic figure. He also has perhaps the less positive thing of he's the very first ever Celtic player to get sent off at the current Celtic Park, which happened in the club's first game that season.
That's what you call a pub quiz question. That's a brilliant question. These wee things that make you more interested in the story of Celtic. I've always said Celtic is a bit like a fairy tale. I think Billy McNeil said it before, that Celtic is a fairy tale. I think some of this book, as I say, would probably be part of the non-fiction if it wasn't so obviously true. And I think that's Celtic through and through. And I think even some of the Celtic, how we're treated with the press, how we're actually dealt with as a club, goes back to the very roots of the club. And in fact, you've linked Celtic and Scottish football becoming professional to almost how the media and how society, football society in general, treated Celtic's victory. It was almost like they were calling in the books to see how Celtic managed to do this, and maybe had a wee bit of a turnover in how the game was structured thereafter. So you could basically say that the media and the FA's kind of dislike of Celtic kind of brought the Scottish game on a wee bit sort of a way, because the game kind of took a new turn after that season, didn't it?
Yeah, I think in fairness, so I think there was different things. Interestingly, one of the things that did happen in that season that the book talks about is it was called the press boycott, because we basically banned some newspapers and journalists from going to Celtic Park. There was a lot of complaints about how they were reporting Celtic. I think especially so. One of the really violent stories from the season involved a riot that followed a moment that looked like we weren't going to win the league. So Celtic were in Paisley to play Abercorn in February of 1893. And this was a game we shouldn't have had any problems winning. Abercorn in the end finished, at the bottom, or the second bottom of the league. This was a game that we should have quite comfortably won, and we don't. We lose the game, and what, to be honest, at the time probably looked like had completely ended our hopes of winning the league. But after the game, as the players are leaving, the Abercorn fans come up by all accounts and attack the Celtic players as they're trying to get back into the pavilion. This results in what basically a small riot. There's fights, Celtic players are being attacked, blood is drawn, is what newspapers were saying. There was another one Celtic player got arrested. So Jerry Reynolds was arrested for assaulting an Abercorn fan, which was deeply unfair because it was almost certainly Dan Doyle hit him. However, Jerry Reynolds was the man that was pointed out, and Jerry Reynolds gets arrested, and Celtic are really angry at the way this is reported in a lot of the newspapers, because Celtic's view is, wait, we've lost the game, we're trying to get off the park, we're the ones who are being attacked, and yet you're writing about how we are the violent ones, how we are the aggressors. And that came to a head. Yeah, that came to a head where we ended up banning some of the newspapers. We refused to advertise in them, which was a big deal, because adverts in those days were, a major, as they still are, of course, were a major part of newspaper income. So there's certainly that aspect of confrontation which exists. I think, in fairness, with the books, there's lots of really funny stories about the finances at the time, and to be honest, almost everyone's at it, and Celtic are at it, Rangers are at it, Hibs are at it, and multiple other teams, and it's the way they try and hide it. I mean, one of the really obvious ways that we were able to pay people, even though we couldn't officially, was that and what the Kellys continued with, the biscuit tin and all the rest of it, you didn't really declare official attendances. Like newspapers, if you read different newspapers, some will say there was 20,000 at the game, some will say there was 15, because they don't know. They're just looking at the crowd and making a guess. And there's a way of siphoning off money, because if there's 20,000 at a game, well, you can just say there's 12, and it's difficult to really know, and you can put some of that money aside to then be used for unofficial payments. And at one point, the SFA are checking. They're not just checking Celtic, in fairness, they're checking several clubs, and it's the really funny excuses that clubs come out with. Celtic's excuse, we say, I would love to send you our books, but unfortunately, a bit like COVID almost, the guy that writes them is currently in a sanatorium, and it wouldn't be safe to send them because they need, disinfected essentially. Rangers say, oh no, we can't because there was a fire, and even though our accounts were all in a safe, they got burnt. Nothing else got burnt, but the accounts got burnt.
And it was the fire.
Well, absolutely. And Hibs have got a really funny one as well, where in the previous few years, where they're covering, I'm making up the numbers, I can't remember the exact numbers, but in the previous few years, Hibs have maybe had 4 different people doing their books as treasurer, but when Hibs hand in the books, they've got one set handwriting, which would perhaps suggest that somebody's been up all night.
Somebody's done it retrospectively. Would you suggest, what I was trying to suggest is, just reading between the lines, would Celtic's winning of that title, would that escalate the SFA's kind of due diligence in terms of what to see where the money's going and how are these players getting paid under the table? Did that maybe play a wee part in it, or was it just a sign of the times, just coming into the modern football world like England already had been doing for a few years? I kind of like, maybe I'm typical Celtic paranoia fan, but it's funny how it took Celtic to win the league for the book to be opened up. And you could say, look, listen, all the clubs are doing it, so let's just make it legal for players to be paid, and then it's a wee bit more parity across the board, and books will have to be balanced. And I was trying to look to the fact that maybe Celtic win the league was just the step too far for some people in the SFA. Just say aye, Matthew, because my paranoia is brilliant. That's how I live my life.
I like a bit of paranoia as much as the next man, but I honestly don't think it's anything to do with that. I think the reality is everyone's at it, and everyone knows everyone's at it. It's one of those situations where it's not that one club's doing it and other people think they're doing it, but they can't prove it. Everyone's doing it. Everyone knows that everyone's doing it. News quite openly talk about it. So Celtic have been pushing. I mean, Celtic are the ones pushing for professionalism. We are the ones who are really in the vanguard of saying we need a professional system. We need to be able to officially pay players. That's the only way we're going to keep our best players and compete with England. So I don't think it's anything to do with that. I think it's a bit like the cracks in the dam were getting so much that by the time you get to 1893, regardless of who'd won the league, we were going to implement professionalism, and that is what happened. So May 1893, the SFA.
I think to summarise your answer, Celtic were absolutely correct to be paranoid, and that was the reason why they changed it. And thanks for answering that, Matthew. one wee question on that season, because we do have to talk about the football, and as a football book, although I find the most interesting parts, as we've discussed, will be the stories and the backstories and the kidnaps and espionage and all the rest of it. But I mean, was there a part in the season where it looked like Celtic might not be heading in the right direction, or was it a turning point? And at what point of the season did the Celtic fans in the 1892-93 season think, okay, this is ours? Can you sum up that for me, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, the Abercorn game I mentioned a minute ago was a big part of we're not going to win, are we? Rangers were having an amazing season. They were, they were unbeaten. They didn't look like they were going to lose at any point, and then we're losing at Abercorn, and we're a good few points off Rangers in the days when it was still 2 points for a win, albeit that we had quite a lot of games in hand. And I think there's an aspect. That Abercorn game was probably a point where people would have thought, this is a step too much. The turning point is undeniably late April. Late April, there's a week where 3 games in that week, 2 of which Celtic are involved in, really turn things. So as I say, Rangers are unbeaten. They are winning most weeks. They're looking really, really strong. And we played for Lanark at home on, I think, the 22nd of April. And we won 6-0. So we were doing what we could do to try and catch them. Rangers, though, were at Boghead. They were playing Dumbarton. And Dumbarton were the champions, but were having a terrible season. In fact, at the end, they came very close to being so low that they could have been thrown out of the league. They were that low down. This was in the days before sort of automatic promotion and relegation. So Rangers went to Boghead. They were expected to comfortably win, and they don't. They'll lose. So, just as just as Celtic are celebrating a 6-0, stories come through, like, that Rangers have lost at Boghead. And that's a big, big issue, because now Rangers have lost and we're playing them a week later. A week later, they're at Celtic Park. And to be honest, that Celtic Park game is the decider. It's not officially, there's still a few games to go. But the reality was, if Rangers had won the game at Celtic Park, we're not going to be able to catch them. Even if we win every single game, we're going to realistically catch them. Equally, if we beat them, the pendulum swings, and that's exactly what happens. We win quite comfortably at Celtic Park against Rangers, and so Rangers, a team that the week before had now lost 2 in a row, and we've now basically completed what is a 4-point swing, a 4-point catch up. And I think that's the moment where we still had a few games to go, and you have to win your games in hand, obviously. But I think, the newspapers at the time quite openly said, whoever wins the Celtic Rangers game tomorrow is going to be champions.
And it's like quite interesting when you mentioned the 4-point swing for 2 matches. I mean, I remember quite vividly that the days when it was 2 points for a win and 1 point for a draw. I mean, the seasons were shortened that condensed that much back then in terms of games played, that Celtic won the league with 29 points. Rangers were second with 28 points. I might be wrong there. Only a 1 point gap difference. And we'd seen before a few seasons previous when Dumbarton and Rangers had both finished on the same points as the league title was shared. I'm not entirely sure if they'd actually changed the rules by 1892-93, but you never know what would have happened had Rangers maybe drawn a match more, or Celtic.
We came close to doing it the year before. So the season before, we finished a point behind Dumbarton. 2 points, but I beg your pardon, 2 points behind Dumbarton the season before. No, the first year of the league. So when Dumbarton and Rangers both finished on joint top points, there was provision. So nowadays, obviously, Dumbarton would have won the league because Dumbarton had a much better goal difference. But the rule was that you had a playoff, and that's exactly what happened. So Rangers and Dumbarton had a playoff that ended in a draw, and I think essentially nobody had really foreseen the idea that even the playoff might end in a draw. So it was agreed that they would share the title. That would have still, the rules hadn't changed. So if Rangers had gained an extra point, it would have been a playoff. But the really funny thing is, I mean, we talk about Rangers, and naturally you look at it from a 2023 perspective. The really funny story, if you go to 1893, is we were best friends with Rangers.
Yeah. I spoke of this before. I mean, I think this
on really well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the history was rewritten with Celtic and Rangers, because I think for the very beginnings, the newspapers were saying these were two friends in arms. You know, both had histories in Ireland. I think a lot of the histories of the club and the relationships changed slightly when the Irish immigrants started to come over in their droves and work in certain parts of the society and things like that. I do believe, and don't forget, I think the phrase "old firm" was coined by the press more to do with the boards rather than the football teams themselves. They said basically these two clubs were like businessmen that were played for replays. I mean, some of the Hampden riots of the early days were caused by Celtic and Rangers fans flinging bottles at each other's players because of, if the game was 0-0 in the last 10 minutes, they would just play for a 0-0 draw. And to get the replay for the extra cash, extra income for the club and extra bonus for themselves. So Celtic and Rangers have always had this close relationship. It turned nasty at a certain point and we never went back since. And I think both of the clubs have grew exponentially because of that, and for different ways for both clubs. And I just want to say that was an excellent wee chat we had, Matthew. I'm really enjoying the discussion on the wee backstories. I'm going to read much more of it when I get the book, and just want to say thanks for coming on, mate. Have you enjoyed yourself on the show, mate?
I have indeed. No, thanks very much for having me. It's always good to talk about these things. You know, as my mum and my wife would say, I never shut up the time. So it's good to be able to spread it to a wider audience.
Oh, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to anybody that's watching. Do that yourself, Matthew. Send the link to your friends and that, and the more viewers, the better. Hopefully, your book does a wee bit better for it, mate. Where can we find your book? I know you said it's in the Celtic shop. We've got the links below on the screen, but if anybody's listening to this on Spotify or Apple, can you tell us how where we've got where we can buy the book from, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a reminder, it's called The Bould Bhoys, glory to their name. That comes from a newspaper article at the time. That's where it comes from. Basically, you can buy it from CelticStarBooks.com. So if you go in there, you can get it there. It's also available in the Celtic shops. And if you're somebody who doesn't like it in hard copy but wants a Kindle version, you can get it through Amazon Kindle as well. So it's in all those places. So hopefully people will enjoy it if they get a chance to get it.
Superb, mate. It's a great book that looks at, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And thanks for your time, Matthew, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We're back at 9 o'clock with John and Russell for the Tuesday Club. So tune in about 40 minutes time. Thanks again, guys, and hail, hail.